Story number 1. Turn it off. I'm an avid hiker and camper. I guess it's because I'm a socially awkward loner who enjoys solitude and silence. Being out in nature allows me to embrace that part of myself. I know what you're thinking. Hiking and camping alone is just asking for trouble. You're not wrong. One night, I had forgotten to bring my matches to light my fire. I might be an avid camper, but even I don't know how to start a campfire without matches. I had my torch for light, but it was starting to get really cold the closer I got to midnight. I wrapped myself as tightly as I could, but even with 2 jackets and my sleeping bag, I wouldn't stop shaking. I decided to turn off the flashlight and get some sleep. The sooner I closed my eyes, the sooner it would be daylight and the sun could warm me up. As soon as I turned off the flashlight, I noticed the warm glow shining in the distance. The thickness of the trees made it almost impossible to determine how far away the glow was. I instantly thought it was another camper's fire. There was no way I was going to suffer the cold all night long, knowing there was a nearby camper who could spare a match or two. I grabbed my flashlight and walked in the direction of the glow. I didn't walk very far before I got close enough to make out the shape of what looked like a house. I wasn't about to just walk up to a random camper, so I crouched in a bush nearby and peered out towards the warm glow. It wasn't coming from a campfire. In front of me, just past the tree line, there was an old wooden cabin. I was instantly confused. I had hiked that trail and camped in those woods countless times, but I never noticed a cabin before. I lifted my flashlight up, and its cold beam split the darkness between me and the warm glow coming from the window of the cabin. In that moment, the glow from within the cabin disappeared, and it was flung into the darkness. My flashlight was the only light left. There was absolute silence as I stared at the cabin. My light rested on the door of the cabin, and after a moment of nothing, the door flung open. My light rested on the tall, dark silhouette of a man. He stood in the doorway and looked directly at me. I could hardly breathe. I couldn't move at all. My heart raced in my chest, and the blood rushing to my head was all I could hear. Then, suddenly, a deep whisper broke the silence. "Turn it off." The man's voice sounded so cold. It was like a hiss from a snake or a growl from a dog. My instincts kicked in and I ran. I turned off the light and ran through the darkness. I would rather trip over a fallen tree I couldn't see than risk the man from the cabin using the light to follow me. I made it back to my campsite in one piece and jumped into my tent. I zipped it up, threw the sleeping bag over my head, and embraced the cold and the dark for the rest of the night. When morning came, I packed up and got as far away from that place as I could. I didn't want to risk going back to the cabin. I hiked to my car and drove home. That voice was the most horrible sound I have ever heard. It was so cold and dead. The man it belonged to still haunts my dreams, as does that cabin. Story number 2. Lost, but not alone. I got lost in the woods a few years ago. It's not as bad as it sounds. My parents found me around an hour later, but in that short hour of wandering around the woods, something terrifying happened to me. We were in the middle of a move to a whole other state. We'd packed what we could into the car, and then my parents, my brother, and I buckled up for the long drive to our new home. The drive took us down a road that was surrounded by trees and led through the middle of the woods. We'd been driving for most of the day, and we were all a little crabby. So my dad pulled over and suggested we eat the lunch my mom packed. We all climbed out the car and set up for a picnic in the trees near the road. I needed to use the bathroom not long after we stopped. I was around 14 years old at the time. Anyway, I was old enough to tell my parents that I didn't need them to come with me. I marched into the trees all by myself with the promise that I won't go too far. Long story short, by the time I turned around to head back, I had no idea where I was. I got lost. I started wandering around, calling out for my parents or my brother, but I didn't get a response. I didn't think I went that far, but I probably got even deeper into the woods by trying to find my way back to the road. At some point, I stumbled upon a wood log cabin. It was in really good shape, so I thought that I was saved. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I peered through the windows, but it was too dark inside to see anything. Now, the whole time I was walking around looking for my parents, I thought I was both lost and completely alone. I was wrong. I wasn't alone. I didn't know anything about sixth sense back then, and I didn't feel like I was being watched. However, when I think about it now, I can remember never feeling at ease. I can remember feeling eyes on the back of my head. As I turned to walk away from the window, I looked at the door again. I'm not sure if it was open or closed when I first knocked on it, but when I looked at it again, it was ever so slightly ajar. Through the small sliver, I spotted movement. I froze and stared at the gap in the open door for the longest time. That's when I saw it. The movement was the blinking of an eye that was staring at me through the gap in the open door. Someone was inside the cabin, watching me. I didn't want them to know that I could see them, so I pretended that I didn't notice. I walked past the door as calmly as I could. I expected the door to fly open and for someone to jump out at me. Thankfully, nothing happened. As I walked away from the cabin, I heard a loud bang as the door slammed shut. That was when I ran. I'm not sure how long I was running for, but eventually I found my way back to the road where my parents were screaming my name. I didn't tell them what happened because they were already freaking out enough. We got into the car and I was grateful to drive as far away from that cabin as possible. That eye stared at me, wide and wild. It sent a chill down my spine and still gives me nightmares today. Story number 3. Winter Vacation. I don't go on many vacations at all. I barely earn enough money to get by and afford enough food to last from one paycheck to the next. However, there was this one Christmas that I got a lucky break. A friend of mine was planning on going to a cabin in the woods during Christmas break with her boyfriend, but they had gotten into a fight near the time and ended up not going. She'd already rented the cabin and there was no way she was going to get her deposit back. She had a lot of other things on her mind at the time, so she didn't want to deal with it. I was good enough friends with her that she decided to treat me for Christmas. She gave me the keys and practically told me to take her vacation. I wasn't about to argue. I couldn't remember the last time I had a break. I packed up and drove out to the cabin as soon as I could. The cabin was beautiful. The snow had already started to fall. The lake the cabin sat by was frozen over, and it was a tranquil kind of silence out in the woods. I knew I was going to love it. I made sure to enjoy my first night. The fire, the hot chocolate, and the Christmas music really made it a night to remember, but the thing I remember the most was what happened after I went to bed. I was only half asleep when a loud smashing sound woke me up. It sounded like glass shattering. I didn't know what to think, so I turned the lights on and headed downstairs to investigate. As I walked down the stairs, I instantly noticed the collection of glass shards on the floor by the front door. The window beside the door was broken. I didn't instantly think that someone had broken it, otherwise I might have reacted differently. I flung the front door open and peered out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything past the end of the front porch. I got that feeling again. I could feel eyes in the darkness looking back at me. There was a moment of silence, then I heard a deep, distant grunt. Something flew towards me from out of the darkness. I noticed it just in time to duck. Something shot past my head and crashed into the cabin behind me. I glanced over my shoulder to see a large rock roll across the wooden floor. I stared at the rock for a second, and the silence was broken once again by a high-pitched cackle. I slammed the door shut and ran back up the stairs. Someone was out there, and they had just thrown a large rock right at my head. I was on the phone to the police in seconds, but it took them over an hour to get out to me. When they arrived, they searched the whole area. They didn't find anyone, but I wasn't going to stay there. They stayed with me while I packed my stuff and escorted me to a hotel in the town nearby. It was my only vacation in years, and someone tried to kill me. Let's just say I won't be going on another vacation anytime soon. Story number 4. One too many drinks. The high school I went to had a little tradition. We were pretty big about our swim team. Whenever our school won a game, the team would go out to this old abandoned cabin in the woods and party. There would be drinks, music, and the one night someone actually built a bonfire that almost burned down the cabin. I wasn't part of the swim team, but one year I started dating someone who was. Obviously, I was there to cheer him on during the match, and he insisted I go with him to the after party when they won. I was never a big fan of parties. I decided to go mainly because I really liked the girl, and I honestly thought that I would get lucky that night. That was the night the team's captain disappeared. I'm not going to use real names for this. So, Mary had been captain of the swim team for 3 years. Because she was the team captain, she took it upon herself to sort of chaperone the whole party. I kind of felt sorry for her. Everyone else was getting drunk and having a good time, while she was doing her best to keep everything under control. Anyway, I was inside the old cabin at the time, trying to keep some stupid jock's hands off of my girlfriend. We'd all honestly had way too much to drink, and it was probably about to get physical. The only reason it didn't was because of the screams we heard. The screams were so horrifying and loud that whoever was playing the music turned it off instantly. We reacted a bit too slowly. The screams were coming from Mary, there was no doubt about it. Everyone ran outside, unsure of what we would find. The screams were in the distance and fading fast. I can hardly remember any part of the night apart from feeling sick in the stomach and lightheaded. I remember running through the woods, chasing down the screams for as long as I could hear them. Eventually, the screams stopped. I was plunged into the silence of the night, and the last of Mary's screams faded into the distance. No one has seen or heard from Mary since that night. We all joined the search party, and the police combed those woods and the cabin several times. There was no evidence of what happened to her. The theory is that one of the homeless drug addicts that used the cabin as a hideout took her off into the woods, and that her body is buried somewhere out there. Honestly, I don't like thinking about it. I only wish I was a little bit less drunk that night, then maybe I would have reacted fast enough to do something. Story number 5. Blood in the Water. There's this little cabin in the middle of the woods that I love visiting. It's not secluded or anything, since there's a popular hiking trail and campsite nearby. The reason I love it so much is because of the mountain lake nearby. I would usually rent the cabin for the weekend and then spend my days swimming in the mountain lake. The mountain water is the freshest and cleanest thing ever. I'd go up there early in the morning, before any of the campers or hikers, and just enjoy the water all by myself. One day, in the middle of summer, the water wasn't as fresh and clean as it seemed. I woke up early, before the sun even started rising, and walked along the trail leading to the mountain lake. I passed a few people on the way, but they were still packing and wouldn't be heading up there anytime soon. When I got there, I noticed the smell instantly. There was a slight breeze, and it brought with it a subtle chemical smell that burned the inside of my nostrils. It wasn't too strong, so I could ignore it and just enjoy my swim. I dived right in. The water felt great. The feeling didn't last very long. I closed my eyes and turned on my back. The world around me became muffled, and I allowed my body to float in the still water. It was pure bliss, but that was when it ended. They say that ignorance is bliss, and I was ignorant when I entered the water that morning. As I floated, my head hit something floating in the water beside me. I flinched. It wasn't hard like a rock, but it was solid and large. I pulled my legs down and turned my body the right way up before turning towards whatever I just hit. The loudest scream escaped my mouth as my eyes met that of a deer, floating lifeless in the water. I panicked and, for a moment, I forgot how to swim. I was splashing in the water, kicking my legs out. All I wanted was to get away from the deer's dead body. I screamed nonstop. Eventually, some hikers that were on their way to the lake heard me and rushed my way. The next thing I knew, someone was in the water with me and dragging me back to shore. One of the hikers thought I was having trouble swimming and dived in after me. It was only after they got me back to shore did we all realize what was going on. The lake was filled with dead animals. Birds, fish, deer, squirrels, and more were all floating on the lake's surface. That chemical smell was from a nearby plant that had an accident. Their chemicals had spilled into the water and were even in the air, killing most of the animals in the area or who had drunk the water. I was quarantined in that cabin for the rest of the week. I felt ill, but I hadn't ingested any water, so I recovered after a few days. That cabin used to hold so many memories for me. Now, I can just smell those chemicals and think about those dead animals in the water. Story number 1. Newspaper Run. I live in one of those small, quaint neighborhoods where everyone has the same picket fence around their house, and the newspaper boy rides down the street on a bike every morning. I'm used to living in the city, so when I first moved there, I was surprised to see a young boy speeding down the street and tossing newspapers onto people's front yards. Walking down the driveway in my slippers and fetching the newspaper every morning quickly became part of my morning routine. The air was fresh and cleared my head before I headed to work. My neighbor was the quiet type. He was around 50 years old. He was your usual grumpy old man yelling at kids to get off his lawn. I kind of loved him for that. He tied the whole living in a small town experience together and made it 100 times better. The one creepy thing about him was how early he woke up. I would go out to fetch my newspaper at around 6 in the morning, and he would already be sitting in a squeaky rocking chair on his porch. He would watch me closely as I walked down my driveway. Like, he would properly stare at me. I don't even think he blinked. I would shrug it off and wave at him, but he wouldn't even wave back at me. He would just stare. For context, I'm a 29-year-old female and I lived alone at the time. I was used to getting unwanted and strange attention from males, especially the older ones. This was several years ago. I live with my husband now and I still get unwanted attention, but now my husband usually deals with the creeps. Since my neighbor was old and looked pretty fragile, I didn't think twice about it. He was just staring at me, which was harmless in my mind. One summer morning, I walked down the driveway to fetch my newspaper. Since it was really hot in the evenings now, I was wearing some really short shorts and a tank top that didn't look very appropriate. The plan was to run down the driveway and back inside as fast as I could. When I got to the bottom of the driveway, I noticed that my neighbor was out on his porch. He was slowly rocking back and forth and staring directly at me. I paused and waved at him as usual. As usual, he didn't wave back. I didn't think anything of it since it was so natural by this point, and I leaned down to pick up the newspaper. By the time I straightened up, with the newspaper in my hand, I looked across the street at my neighbor's house, and he was gone. I stared at the empty rocking chair for a moment. I had never seen my neighbor leave that rocking chair until late in the afternoon, so it was a bit strange to see it empty. I shook it off and turned back to head towards my house. I was walking back up the driveway when I heard footsteps behind me. My driveway was made out of gravel, so it was easy to hear if someone was walking over it. I spun round on my heels and came face to face with my neighbor. He was standing right behind me, and the moment our eyes met, he froze. I watched as a weak, sickly smile spread from one cheek to the other. It was so weak that his smile was literally shaking, as if he wasn't strong enough to hold it up. He just stared at me, unblinking. I'm going to be honest, I didn't know what to do. I kind of just backed away slowly. I treated him like a wild animal in the woods. Thankfully, he didn't follow me. He just stood in the middle of my driveway, staring at me with that shaky smile and not blinking the whole time. I reached my house, shut the door, and peeked at him through the blinds. I think he stood there for a solid 10 minutes before he finally turned around and wobbled back towards his house. I have no idea what he was thinking or what he was doing. To this day, that was the creepiest experience I've ever had. Story number 2, Peeping Tom. I lived next door to a Peeping Tom for most of my childhood. I didn't actually know what a Peeping Tom was when I was younger, but as I grew older, I slowly started to realize how messed up my neighbor's kid actually was. The creepy thing is, his name was Tom. When we first moved in, I remember the day like it was yesterday because I was not happy about leaving my old town and all of my friends behind. Tom was the first person I met. He was my neighbor's son, and as far as we could tell, it was just him and his dad. He didn't have any siblings, and the mom didn't seem like she was in the picture. I didn't like Tom at first. I got a weird feeling from him. He was smiling all of the time, didn't speak, and mostly just stared at me. My little sister was around 6 at the time, and I was 9. I didn't hang out with her much, and I wasn't interested in making any new friends yet, but my parents encouraged me to give him a chance. Reluctantly, I did. There was a pool in our back garden, and that was honestly the best thing about the move for me. It was the middle of winter when we moved there. The pool was empty, but the moment summer came around, we filled it with water, and I ended up spending most of my time out there. Tom didn't seem that upset that I wasn't hanging out with him as much anymore. I only found out why a few years later. I was tanning out by the pool one day. My little sister was playing in the pool, and I was lying down on the warm bricks beside it. I had my eyes closed for most of the time. Then I had that feeling that I was being watched. I opened my eyes and looked around. It took a while for my eyes to adjust at first. Once they did adjust, I didn't see anything straight away. Then, peeking at me through the gap in between the wooden planks making up the fence surrounding our back garden, was a pair of eyes. I was frozen. Those eyes looked straight at me, and I looked straight at them. Now, I'd been hanging out with Tom almost every day since we moved in, which was at least 3 months before this incident. So, when I say I recognized the eyes instantly as Tom's, it's because I saw them so many times before. When I called to him, he ran away from the fence. I was so young at the time, I didn't think that much about it. I did see him looking at me from the other side of the fence whenever I went out to the pool. It was only years later that I started feeling uncomfortable about it. I never told my parents because I still didn't understand how strange it actually was. Thankfully, we moved away from that house not too long after that, and I've never seen Tom again. Story number 3, The Doll Next Door. I hate dolls. They terrify me, and I won't even let any of my children have any. I can trace my hatred for dolls back to the small apartment I lived in while I was at university. I shared an apartment with 3 other guys at the time, since neither of us could actually afford an apartment on our own. We all went to the same university, although we had different classes, so we barely saw each other outside of the apartment. I'm sure from our shared experiences that their hatred for dolls is just as strong as mine. Our next-door neighbor at the time was an older woman. She was lonely and often talked about her sons never coming to visit. We were just trying to be polite, so we'd stand in the hallway and listen to her stories. I felt sorry for her. She talked about having 5 sons, but none of them even wanted to visit her now that she was old. Anyway, she had this huge doll collection. This one day, she somehow tricked me and one of the other guys into agreeing to a tour of her doll collection. She had a whole room filled with them. There were floor-to-ceiling shelves lining the walls, stuffed full of dolls. It was creepy. That was only the beginning. She started leaving her dolls lying all over the hallway. It was only her apartment, which was directly across from ours, and another apartment at the end of the hall that was empty at the time. So, we were really the only ones there. We'd come home to a doll sitting outside her door one day. The next day, the same doll would be sitting outside our door. We brushed it off at first. She was a lonely old lady with an obsession with dolls, and for the most part she was harmless. One day, I came home early from the university because one of my lecturers didn't show up. There weren't any dolls in the hallway, which I was grateful for. I was so fixed on the dolls that might be in the hallways that I didn't notice my apartment door was open. None of my roommates were supposed to be home soon, and we all pretty much remembered to close and lock the door behind us when we left. This had never happened before. I was cautious as I walked into my apartment. I guess I was expecting to find an intruder, or at least some kind of evidence of an intruder. That is nowhere near what I did find. I walked into the apartment to find the same doll sitting right in front of the door, looking up at me. At this point, the old lady across the hall didn't seem that harmless anymore. She'd broken into our apartment while we were gone, just to leave one of her creepy dolls by the door. I was angry, but I was more scared. It was the creepiest thing I could remember happening to me at any point in my life. The lady didn't really do anything else after that point. I told my roommates about it. We agreed not to do anything about it, but we all avoided the old lady after that point. Since that point, I hate dolls more than anything else. Story number 4. The Ratman. New York isn't known for being the best place to find friends. I think the weirdest and creepiest neighbor stories I've heard have all come from New York. So, I have a creepy neighbor story of my own from the brief time I spent in New York City. I had a work-study at a newspaper company, which I won't name, so I just moved to New York for a couple of months. I really wanted to be a journalist. At the time, I was willing to go through anything for that work-study. My apartment was bad, the neighborhood sucked, and my neighbors were really rude and creepy. There was a man who was by far the creepiest out of all of my neighbors. Thankfully, he didn't live on the same floor as me, but I saw him every day. He would hang out on the stairs, and since the elevator was broken, I had to walk past him whenever I left for work and came back home. That in itself is not creepy. The creepy thing is I would walk past him and he'd be holding and petting the largest rat I have ever seen. The rat was the size of a large cat or a small dog. The rat would even squeak loudly and violently when I walked past. I started referring to him as the Ratman. I tried making jokes out of it, but man, it was creepy. I put up with it because of my work-study. The creepiest thing that happened was that one day when I walked past him on the stairs, he didn't have the rat in his hands anymore. Honestly, trying to guess where the rat went or what he did with it was more terrifying. Story number 5. Shattered. I hit hard times a few years ago, just before the pandemic. It got so bad to the point where I had to move back in with my parents. My parents had moved to a new house in a new neighborhood recently, and I hadn't been to visit them yet. Before I moved in with them, I heard a lot of stories about their next-door neighbors. My parents hated them, and they often told me about the fights they would have. They would have loud parties in the middle of the week and keep my parents up until late. They would park my parents in, and my father would have problems getting to work in the morning. They said that their neighbors even left a threatening note on their porch once, but they had no proof. Anyway, I knew all of this before I had moved in with them, but I hadn't met the neighbors yet and I had no idea what to expect. The first time I met them, I was unpacking my car. I spotted them peering out their front door at me. They looked very unimpressed, shaking their heads and frowning. Despite all the stories I heard, I was determined on making a good impression since I didn't know how long I was going to be staying there. I gave them a friendly wave and smile, but they just retreated into their house and slammed the door. I shrugged it off and continued on with my life. I've been told that I have a bad temper, and I guess I escalated the problem just by being there. All the things that my parents told me about continued to happen. Where my parents learned to live with it, I slowly got angrier and angrier at the situation. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I woke up to my parents complaining that my father was going to be late to work again because the neighbors had parked them in. Now, our neighbors had a driveway and garage of their own. They could park in front of their own house. Instead, they decided to park in front of my parents' driveway and stop my father from being able to drive out. I got so angry, I stomped over to their house and banged on the door. My face was red and I had to hold myself back from ripping the door off its hinges. Basically, when they opened the door, it escalated into a full-on screaming match that woke up most of the neighborhood. I think someone even called the cops. I don't remember it that well, but it was bad. That's not the bad thing that happened. I lost my temper and I made things so much worse for my parents. We didn't hear from the neighbors in a while until one day we came back from a night out. We pulled up to the house and instantly saw that all the windows at the front of the house were smashed. There was shattered glass all over the place. As we went around the house, we found that every single window was shattered from the outside, and the glass shards were lying all over the floor inside. Now, we had no proof that it was the neighbors that did it, but neither I nor my parents had any doubt in our minds that it was them. Now, as creepy as that was, they didn't really do anything else after that. They kept to themselves and stopped bothering us. I think I scared them just as much as they scared us. I don't live with my parents anymore, but they haven't told me anything bad about the neighbors since. Story number 1. The Hoya Bashu Forest. I'm a huge skeptic of the paranormal. I believe that there is an explanation for everything strange and unusual. That's the kind of reason why I got into ghost hunting. You could say that I want to be proven wrong. I want to be made a believer. I have been to some of the most haunted places in the world, but none of them made me a true believer until I visited the Hoya Bashu Forest in Romania. The forest is famous for being one of the most haunted forests in the world. There are so many stories about paranormal activities and strange phenomena happening within the trees. I went there not believing in any of it. It's often been referred to as the Bermuda Triangle of Transylvania due to so many people disappearing. I heard a story of a shepherd who went missing along with 200 sheep. He went into the forest and was never seen again. That, along with many other stories, is the reason I just had to go visit the forest and see this all for myself. It was a crisp winter morning when my guide drove up to the parking lot just outside the entrance to the forest trails. The trees were strange there. I was told they were hundreds of years old, but they looked so young. The trunks were twisted and bulging in weird ways. An eerie fog hung low over the ground, and I honestly got a bad feeling the moment we got there. My main fear was getting lost, which is how I explain so many people disappearing inside the forest. It's a large area, and the trees are so large and thick that it would be easy for someone to lose their way. So, I stuck close to my guide as he led me down the trails. I was filming myself for my family back home. For the first half of the trip, nothing happened. Despite the eerie feeling, which was most likely caused by the early morning fog, the forest was just a forest. However, as I continued to check my phone and found out it was well into the afternoon, the morning fog hadn't faded. It was still as thick as ever, covering the floor to the point where I couldn't even see my own feet. If it weren't for my guide, I would have lost the trail already. At some point, I was filming a unique-looking tree trunk when I spotted something in the distance. It was a slim, tall figure. It was so dark, as if it was just a shadow being cast, but there was nothing to cast it and nothing for it to be casted on. The shadow was just standing in the middle of the forest. I watched it for a moment, thinking it was just another person exploring the forest. They didn't move. The whole time I looked at them, they just stood there. I think the weirdest part about it is how still they were. If you ever watched someone standing in the distance, there's always a subtle movement. They will sway or flinch, but this person was unusually still. The longer I stared, the weirder they looked. Soon, they didn't resemble a person at all. It was just a dark blob standing in the middle of the forest. I couldn't pull my eyes away. I had this knot forming in my stomach, and it was growing and getting worse. I felt sick. I didn't want to look away. I was terrified that if I looked away, they would disappear. In that moment, I heard twigs snapping behind me. That sudden sound showed me how quiet it was, and it also made me jump up and spin round. It was just the tour guide stepping in the bushes behind me. He checked if I was okay, and I nodded. I turned back to where the shadow was standing, and a shiver ran up and down my spine. It was gone. I ran forward to where the shadow was standing. I could hear my tour guide freaking out behind me. I didn't care. At this point, I'm trying to debunk anything that could be paranormal. I checked everywhere, but I couldn't find anyone. The forest was empty aside from me and my tour guide chasing me down. I couldn't explain it. I looked away for only a second. There was no way that a person could have disappeared in that amount of time. It didn't look like a person. The image in my mind was a tall, slim, black blob. The more I thought about it, the more it looked nothing like a human. It was just a thing. It had no shape, no face, and no color whatsoever. I still can't explain it, even to this day. If anything has made me a believer, it was that moment. Story number 2, Karasta Prison by Candlelight. You could say I'm mad or have a crazy idea of fun, but I love going on haunted tours. There are places that are considered to be the most haunted in the world, and you can go on tours of those places. The Karasta Naval Port Prison is on that list. It's considered to be extremely haunted, and it's not difficult to see why. I believe that places become haunted after being exposed to a lot of negative energy. During its time as a military prison, Karasta saw a lot of negative energy. Its history is a horrific one. Prisoners there were treated horribly. They were tortured and brutally murdered. No prisoner would even dare to escape because of the punishment that awaited them if they failed. It's no wonder why today it is one of the most haunted places in the world. The tour was amazing. The tour guide took a huge group of us through the whole prison. They gave us the history of the place and explained what every building was used for when it was operational. The end of the tour was the best part for me, and it was also the most terrifying. I paid for the full tour, and that meant I was going to be left alone in one of the cells with nothing but a candle to light my way. It was pitch black. There was a cold draft coming in, but I couldn't make out where it was coming from. I was sitting on the bed, but it was mostly metal wires and springs at that point. It creaked slightly under my weight. I was freaking out, but I was also enjoying myself. My eyes were playing tricks on me. I thought I was seeing shadows in the darkness. For a moment, I thought a man was peeking at me from the doorway, but when I raised my candle up, the shadow disappeared. I stood up and decided to walk out of the room. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there. I was only supposed to be there for an hour. I grabbed the walls with one hand and walked down the long hallway. I passed many other cells on my way. At some point, I didn't feel like I was alone. I glanced over my shoulder and used the candlelight as best I could. I was in complete darkness. With the candlelight, I could barely see my own hand stretched out in front of me. I heard a voice behind me. It was a raspy whisper. It felt like a cold breath down the back of my neck. I spun round, but there was nothing there. As I turned my back, there was another voice from behind me again. I turned around once again, but there was nothing there. I couldn't tell what the whispers were saying, but I could hear a voice saying something to me. I looked down the hall and stretched my candle out in front of me. Still, I couldn't see anything. "Is there someone there?" I called down the hall. My voice echoed down the hallway, and something answered. I could swear I heard the same raspy voice reply, "Hello." I backed away from the voice. I couldn't see anyone. There was no one in there with me, but something was talking to me. At this point, tears were building up in my eyes. I was there to have fun, but it was quickly turning into the most terrifying experience of my life. I turned back to where the voice had come from, and I waited. I watched and listened. I was waiting to hear the voice again. For the longest time ever, there was only silence. In that silence, I heard a breath, and my candle went out. I screamed my head off. I don't think I have ever screamed that loud before. I was plunged into complete darkness, and I was convinced that there was someone in that hallway with me, someone that just blew out my candle. The tour guides rushed to my aid. The lights turned on, and they were asking me so many questions. I didn't know what to tell them. I knew there was something in there with me. They kept trying to assure me that I was the only one in the building, but I know what I heard, and there was someone or something there with me. Story number 3. My experience at the most haunted house in the world. There are a lot of places in the world that are considered to be haunted. It takes a lot for something to be considered the most haunted place in the world. There has to be a lot of different people experiencing the paranormal in the same area for anything like that to happen. House number 24 at Jeleń in Poland is known as one of the most haunted houses in the world. Anyone who has ever lived in that house has left in the middle of the night because of poltergeist activity or ghost sightings. Ever since then, it's open for ghost hunters and adventurers to stay the night. It's a challenge that I couldn't pass up. The tour is only open to groups of 2 or more, so I convinced my friend to stay overnight with me. We had a lot of fun throughout the night. Not much happened, and we were trying to get things to happen. We brought all sorts of equipment, and we tried to communicate with whatever was living in the house, but for some reason we didn't get anything for most of the night. We went to bed, disappointed that the house might not actually be haunted. Because my friend and I didn't believe the place was haunted anymore, we decided to sleep in separate rooms. That night, something woke me up. My eyes snapped open, and I looked up at a pitch-black ceiling. I'm not sure what woke me up. I lied completely still in the bed, and it took me a moment to realize that it wasn't my choice to just lie there. I couldn't move. There was a heavy pressure on my chest. It was as if something was sitting on top of me, but I was looking up at the ceiling and there was nothing on my chest. Once I realized that I was fully awake but I couldn't move, I also noticed this feeling tugging at the back of my mind. I wasn't alone. It felt like there was someone in the room with me. I couldn't even turn my head. I was forced to stare at the ceiling, and I felt like there was something staring at me in the darkness. That was when something grabbed my foot. I opened my mouth and I was able to scream. The moment the scream left my mouth, it was as if I woke up for the first time. I sat up in the bed, still screaming. My friend rushed into the room to check on me. I couldn't even explain to him what happened because I couldn't even understand what happened. Something was in the room with me, and I swear it touched my foot. To this day, I'm not sure what happened in that room, but I will never go back to that house again. Story number 4. The trees are watching. I live in Romania, and I've only ever gone to the Hoya forest once in my adult life. That one visit was enough of an experience for me for a lifetime. I knew the place pretty well from when my parents took me there when I was younger. I went alone, and I think that's the part that makes the whole experience that much more terrifying. I was walking along the trail in the late afternoon. Not a lot of people like being out there when it's even slightly dark, so I knew it would be quiet. I had my flashlight with me, and up until that point, I wasn't a true believer of all that paranormal stuff. I didn't think anything could happen to me. It started getting dark, so I started heading back towards my car. It was at this point that I heard something behind me. It was like a soft footstep crunching down on the dried leaves covering the ground. The whole time I'd been hearing my own footsteps do the same, but I knew for certain that this one footstep that echoed out behind me was independent of my own. I spun round on my heels and shined my flashlight in the direction of the footstep. I didn't see anyone directly in the light beam, but out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a face peeking at me from behind a tree. I shot the flashlight over there. Once the beam hit the tree, the light was gone. I can't even begin to explain the face I saw. It was small, like that of a child's. Its eyes were wide and yellow as if it was sick. They didn't seem to blink the whole time it stared at me. Then there's the feeling I got while it was looking at me. When my eyes met its, I just knew that even though it looked like a child, it wasn't human. I turned back and practically raced down the trail back towards my car. I continued to hear footsteps echoing out behind me. It was following me. I just kept moving as fast as I could without letting the underbrush trip me. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to risk seeing those eyes staring at me from behind a tree again. I'm convinced that thing followed me all the way to my car. I heard the footsteps in the forest even as I was running through the parking lot. As I turned my car around and headed towards the exit, I saw it again. It was waiting for me by the entrance to the trail. Those wide, yellow eyes just stared at me as I drove away. I don't want to go back there ever again, because I know it will be waiting for me. Story number 1. I remember one of the scariest things that ever happened to me was when I was in an airport when I was around 8 years old. I practically lived in airports up until the year I turned 15. At that point, my parents decided that I needed a little bit of stability in my life, especially when it came to education. Before that, though, we traveled a lot. This was because of their jobs as news journalists for a pretty big newspaper at the time. By the time this story took place, my parents basically let me walk around the airports all by myself. I knew my way around. I usually only walked off alone if I needed to use the bathroom or if I was thirsty and wanted some water. One day, I wandered off to get something to drink without letting my parents know. I found a water cooler, but all the cups were gone. A man spotted me, I think he was the janitor, and he told me that they were currently restocking the cups. I leaned against the wall beside the water cooler and waited. It wasn't long before I noticed that some guy was watching me. He wasn't just looking over at me, he was blatantly staring at me. My eyes accidentally met his, and his emotionless face instantly changed as his lips curled into a wide, sickly smile. I felt uncomfortable straight away. I stayed by the water cooler and did my best to avoid eye contact with him. That was a mistake. During the time I was trying not to look at him, he got up from his seat, walked over to me, and leaned against the wall beside me. I practically jumped out of my skin. He had the same sickly smile on his face as he looked down at me. He started flirting with me. I was trying to be friendly, but somehow he mistook that as me flirting back. That was when he started saying a lot of inappropriate things. Now that I'm older, it wouldn't really shock me if someone started talking to me like that. Back then, when I was only 8, I almost threw up because of the things he was saying. That was when I told him that I needed to go. His mood changed instantly. As I pushed off the wall to walk away, he threw his arm in front of me. He pressed his hand against my chest and practically slammed my back into the wall. Then he stepped in front of me, put both his hands against the wall right beside my head, and leaned in close to me. His eyes were wide with fury, and his lips were twisted into a scowl. He leaned in so close that our noses were practically touching. He kept saying things like how he didn't give me permission to leave, or telling me how he owns me. I was terrified. I'm pretty sure I was shaking, and I actually felt physically ill. I didn't know how I was going to get out of that situation. I wanted to run and scream, but he had me cornered. To this day, I'm forever grateful to the guy that showed up to refill the plastic cups. The guy moved away from me when the man with the plastic cups started questioning what was going on. As soon as I saw my chance, I ran. I ran straight back to my parents. I didn't tell them what happened. I knew they would make a scene and that I would have my wandering privileges taken away from me. As upset as I was, I pushed it out of my mind. I never forgot about it, though. That moment has stuck with me, and I am extra cautious whenever I go anywhere alone, even to this day. Story number 2. I hate flying. I have a huge fear of heights, and I've read way too many statistics about plane crashes, drunk pilots, and how likely survival from either of these is. Basically, I avoid planes as often as I can. I drive if at all possible, and if not possible, I go on a boat. Yes, there are just as many dangers in cars or on boats, but I can swim, and I'm a good driver. There's something about putting your life in someone else's hands. You just sit back while someone else flies you through the air. It's just not for me. I guess all of this means nothing when it comes to this story. I did end up boarding a plane. I guarantee it was completely unavoidable. Anyway, my very first flight only solidified my utter hatred and fear of flying. We were about halfway through the flight and in the middle of the ocean. I had no idea where exactly. I had gone through at least 5 of those tiny alcohol bottles. The hostess could tell I was nervous as hell, so she just kept bringing more. At some point, we heard the pilot's voice over the intercom. It was hard to understand him. He was slurring his words, and it sounded like he was crying. I heard the word sorry over and over again, but I wasn't sure what he was sorry for. This is probably because of how tipsy I was, because whatever he said had the rest of the plane in a panic. The air hostess rushed to the front and started pounding on the door leading to the pilot. A few of the passengers got up to help them, but they couldn't get it open. I had no idea what was going on at this point. As I looked around, the passengers in their seats were either bursting into tears or screaming their heads off. I sobered up real quick. I tried to ask the person next to me what was happening, but they were too busy crying. That's when the plane suddenly tipped forward. I felt the seatbelt dig into my stomach. Everyone who wasn't seated flung down the aisle. The plane was headed straight down. I had the window seat, so I could see that we were headed straight for the ocean below us. The speed at which we were descending had my life flashing before my eyes. I still had no idea what was going on. In that moment, I knew that I was going to die. Then the plane began leveling out. We didn't crash. We started rising again, and the door to the pilot finally opened. The air hostess and some passengers rushed in. Later, they came out with the pilot. He had a black eye, and his hands were tied behind his back with what looked like a phone charger. It wasn't until we landed at the nearest airport that I finally found out what had happened. The pilot had a breakdown on the plane. He'd recently divorced his wife of 7 years and lost custody of the children. No one knew it since he looked so calm and collected on the outside, but he was only seconds away from snapping. He snapped while piloting that plane. He went onto the intercom to tell everyone how sorry he was, but that he just couldn't take it anymore. He was going to nosedive that plane into the ocean, no matter how many of us he took with him. Thankfully, the co-pilot managed to overpower him and set the plane right. Believe me when I say, I am never getting on another plane. Story number 3. I work at an airport. It's not one of those great jobs, like a pilot or an air hostess. I don't get to go on the plane and travel. I just stay at the airport. I have the privilege of packing the planes. Now, I don't handle your luggage. I work mostly with cargo planes. So, I'll be dealing with the large crates filled with supplies for stores and that. I usually don't have to deal with anything that hectic. During my one night shift, I was operating the forklift. I moved all the large crates and boxes to the plane first. We like to position the larger cargo first so it's easier to pack the smaller crates around them. After I finished that, one of my coworkers came running up to me. He was really excited about something and begged me to follow him back to the cargo hold. I parked the forklift and followed him. There were a few more crates that needed packing. He led me straight past that pile and to the pile that was meant to be loaded on the next plane. I was confused and I was thinking this was all a prank. I half expected someone to jump out at me. We rounded the large pile and lying on the floor behind it was a coffin. I've heard my coworkers talking about this before. Someone might die while on vacation and their family has their body transported back. Packing a coffin in with the cargo isn't unheard of, but I've never done it before. I'll admit it freaked me out. I've never really been around any dead bodies before. I'm pretty young and everyone I know is still alive. I've never even been to a funeral. Something about knowing that there's a dead body in that coffin just sends shivers up and down my whole body. I did my best to avoid it during my shift, and I even asked my coworker if I could just skip packing the next plane. He agreed since he saw how freaked out I was. I decided to take the hour for my break. It was a small cargo plane, so I figured they'd be done packing once the hour was up. I was sitting in the break room, enjoying a coffee and the last stale bagel from the morning run, when I heard screaming outside. I rushed out of that break room so fast that I barely knew what was going on. I didn't know why anyone would be screaming or what could be happening. I got out into the cargo hold to find my coworker on the floor behind the coffin. He was just staring at it. His eyes were wide and filled with terror. When I asked what was wrong, he simply raised a shaky hand and pointed at the coffin. The moment his finger pointed at the coffin, as if he'd used some kind of spell on it, there was a knock on the wood. We both let out a yelp. I jumped back and my coworker scrambled to his feet. He ran around the coffin and threw himself behind me. I was both frightened but also curious. It wasn't until the next sound that came out of the coffin for me to actually act on my curiosity. "Help me," were the words we both heard yelled out in the softest, most childlike voice. Now, this wasn't a child coffin. It was fully sized for an adult. I couldn't fathom why a child's voice would be coming from an adult's coffin. I had a suspicion, so I walked forward and threw the coffin open. The suspicions were correct. There was a child lying inside the coffin on top of the dead body. I heard stories about children smuggling themselves across borders in the cargo holds of airplanes. I never suspected that one of them would hide inside a coffin of all things. That's what happened. My coworker and I felt very silly for thinking it was the dead body inside knocking on the wood, but it was just the child calling for help quickly after he realized he was running out of air. Story number 4. I bet you've never seen or even heard of an abandoned airport before. Airports are rarely empty. They operate 24/7, and there are always crowds of people lining up to board the next flight. Let me tell you, there's something so strange and surreal about seeing an airport completely empty. I explore abandoned buildings for a living. I take artsy photos, write a short story about the place, and post it all on my blog. You'd be surprised how many people will pay to own photos like those, especially when the building is condemned and about to be torn down. Those photos instantly become one of a kind. I've encountered some weird things during my explorations, but nothing was ever as creepy as this abandoned airport. I rocked up early in the morning while the sun was still rising. The golden hour is what we photographers like to call it. I took some clean shots of the outside and started exploring inside. This wasn't an international airport, so it was kind of small, but it still took me all day to work my way through the interior. I'd been through the building the previous day with a guide, so he could show me all the dangerous spots that I should avoid. However, when I go in to take my shots, I like to be the only one in the building. This really heightens the feeling of abandonment. That day, unlike many days I've had, I didn't feel alone. That feeling you have when you think you hear an echo of footsteps behind you, but you turn around and no one is there. You're sure you can feel someone watching you. There are eyes in every dark corner, and your mind starts playing tricks on you. I had that feeling the whole time I was there. I didn't let it distract me from my job. I took the photos as quickly as I could, and I rushed out of there. That night, I was going through the photos I'd taken on my laptop and writing up my blog about the airport. I was 3 coffees in and hyper-focused by the time I noticed it. In the background of one of the photos, I could clearly see the silhouette of a man standing in the shadows. The sight of him sent chills up and down my spine. I scanned through the rest of the photos, this time keeping an eye out for the man. He was in every single photo, just hiding in the shadows. The worst part was, he was looking right at the camera. He was looking right at me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt sick. The fact that he was in every single photo that I took just let me know that he was following me around the whole day. He could have done anything to me, and, honestly, that thought is scarier than what actually happened. Story number 5. I once got lost in an airport. I haven't been in airports a lot since my family doesn't travel. One summer, my parents decided to treat us to a short trip to Alaska. We were more of a winter family. My older brother and I play ice hockey, and my mother is a figure skater. So, summer isn't exactly our time of year. I was around 12 at the time, not really young, but also not old enough to make any good decisions. On the day of the flight, we arrived early and had to wait a long time before our flight started boarding. About an hour in, I really needed to use the bathroom. I got up and went off in search for one. Like I said, I was a 12-year-old boy, so my parents didn't really worry about letting me walk around by myself. Anyway, I got lost. I had no idea which way to go, and I didn't know how to read the airport signs. I think the more I tried to find my way back, the more I got lost. I had wandered into a more quiet part of the airport. There weren't a lot of people there, and the only interaction I had was with a janitor after I asked him how I could find my way back to my boarding gate. He gave me directions, and I started back that way. On my way back, I heard someone calling for me. "Hey, kid." It was a raspy whisper coming from around the corner beside me. I turned to see a man sticking his head around the corner and smiling at me. His eyes were darting around. At the time, I thought he was just being weird. It's only now that I'm older that I realize he was really trying not to be seen. I turned to him and he beckoned for me to come closer. He said he was lost and wanted me to help him find a way out. I was lost too, but the janitor gave me directions back to my parents. I told the guy that, and he freaked out. He said he wanted my help only, and no one else's. This was when I got my first red flag. He just kept telling me to follow him and beckoning me around the corner. I leaned to the side and peeked down the corner behind him. It was dark and empty. If I went there then, no one would be able to see us. I didn't know why at the time, but something about the guy gave me the creeps. I shook my head and insisted that we go find my parents and ask for help. That's when the guy got angry. He started yelling and cursing. I didn't want to deal with it anymore, so I ran away. I followed the janitor's instructions and found my way back to my parents. The man didn't follow me, and I didn't bother telling my parents about him. Now that I'm older, I realize that I probably should have told them. That man was planning on doing something to me. I'm just glad I had the good sense to get out of there, but other kids might have been more naive.